Archaeology and the Bible. I'll give you just a little background. I've been to Israel 5 times. The first time I went there was in December of '72. And at the time I was going to school over in Switzerland, my brother was pursuing a master's at Hebrew University in archaeology. Getting a master's at Hebrew, I would only learn this later myself, and I learned it the hard way. Getting a master's in archaeology is equivalent of getting a doctorate here on any other thing that you're talking about. It's about equivalent in Israel getting a master's in archaeology to getting an MD degree here. I mean, you have to go through everything, and it's all you have to go to the digs, you have to do your service, you have to whatever, you've got to learn a couple languages, Akkadian, you have to learn the ancient script of the Hebrew script. You've got to they're all there's just so much besides the fact you have to learn all your techniques of how to actually do your excavation, all the different things. Well, my first experience, and really my brother ran me around to a lot of the places. Some of the places we'll see some of the slides here actually. Jericho I still remember quite vividly. These were the days when we could still go places without having our own Uzis or submachine guns, and worrying about our protection, because this was, this is '72. This is just 5 years after the '67 war. I mean, there were still burnout tanks here and there and stuff like this, but generally we didn't have too much problem in many things. The next time I had experience, that was '72. '75 I went, actually I was going to Jerusalem to hang out in the old city with an Armenian jeweler, because I was in business at Ambassador. One of my businesses, you have to make a living, support yourself and pay your college bills, and at $1.60 an hour you weren't getting rich working at the college, let me tell you. They paid us the bottom minimum wage for whatever we did as students, and so that never could pay the bills, so you had to do something else as well as that. And so I was selling jewelry, and we were importing it from Jerusalem, because my brother made these contacts, and I was supposed to go over there and learn from him, and he was in the old city. This Armenian. He later, by the way, talk about church events. He was an Armenian, and the Armenians in the old city they would lock the door of their quarter, because you had the Jewish quarter, the Muslim quarter, the Armenian quarter, the Greek quarter. You had these areas in the old cities, and they would lock them actually at night. This is the way they had ethnic harmony. In other words, they would guard themselves from each other at night. They'd lock the doors and bolt or whatever, and because otherwise it could be really dangerous. And it was a dangerous place, because my friend was eventually murdered. He was stabbed to death, this Armenian jeweler. But it was an inside job. The reason why he was stabbed is that he began to suspect that the local bishop of the Armenian church was pocketing all the tithe money. And he was out after, he had started questioning and raising questions in the community. And this guy just hired a hitman, and they knifed him to death in an alley one night. I mean, this was, this is, they take their religion seriously in some of these places. That's how they settle church disputes. The old-fashioned way, the way they've done it for centuries. If you really know your history, that's the way they did a lot of this stuff for centuries. But anyways, bottom line is, I didn't get to spend the summer with him because my brother shanghaied me, said, I need help. You forget your plans while you came over here. I had to help him organize the students in the dig, and we were digging at the Temple Mount. We're digging, as you look at it from the southern wall, you had the steps which Jesus and the disciples would walk up to go to the temple. That had been excavated, so you could see that already there. But they were excavating all around on just the front part of it. It's all excavated at this point in time, but in '75 we were still doing it. And the head archaeologist was Benjamin Mazar. He still has a granddaughter, and he has one of his nephews still are Israeli archaeologists. In fact, I spent some time with one of his nephews when I went back in '91, which was very interesting, talking to him and things like this. But we were doing this, and so I spent the summer digging there among the ruins of the Second Temple, the ones the Romans killed, burnt and threw the stuff down. I was digging in all this stuff, which was kind of kind of a unique experience. And then when I went back later on, I went back in '91 because I was thinking about doing my master's. That's when I figured out how difficult and how long it was going to be taking. I figured out I didn't have the money. Bottom line, I didn't have the money to bring my family over there. And the political situation had changed so much. You could no longer live in the cheap part of the city, which was in the Arab part of the city, not without taking your life in your hands if you're a Westerner of any sort. And so, but anyways, during this time, I was studying Hebrew, and I was also taking an archaeology class and a Middle Eastern studies class and things like this. And the class that I did in archaeology took us all over Israel. And I was, it was an archaeologist who showed us a whole variety of stuff. And that's where I did my, I got, it's a good 1 semester course, 5, 6 months. But we ran all over. She was really gung-ho, and I loved it. And the final exam was on Masada, where I had to do a paper on Masada, and we went up to Masada and we presented. I had to present the paper and our argument of why this and this and this and this, and show, and make our case, which is what you had to do. Okay, that was the beginning steps, because archaeology, and what I want to get to, archaeology in the Bible, in some ways these are like fighting words to some people. In the archaeological community, you find there are really two different sides. You have those that tend to be minimalists. They don't really think the Bible is that reliable from this standpoint, and they tend to think it's exaggerated. And then you have the other side that says, you've got to be nuts. There's so much information here that it's highly, it's highly historic. Their historicity is remarkable. A few years ago, this came out in 2005. This is an NIV, the Archaeological Bible, and it's just full of all the different relevant points. It is absolutely full. There are literally thousands of points that confirm the historicity of the Bible. Now, as I said, archaeology itself is as much an art as it is a science. I mean, there is a lot of science to it, but it's also art to how you see facts. It's just like if you took the facts of DNA researcher or something like this, or if you're a geologist, how do you understand the facts of what you know in the science? See, it depends upon what your framework is. And in many different ways, archaeologists will shade, they'll their conclusions or the datings of the things they find. They'll do all sorts of different things, and they'll argue back and forth among themselves. And this is why you have the journals. You read it, it's like an inside fighting over theological doctrine. It really is, and they fight tooth and nail, because archaeology in some ways is the national sport of Israel. For an intellectual, I'm not overstating that, really. From an intellectual standpoint, an academic standpoint, it is hot potato. It's hot potato politics, and it's hot potato just because of people's point of view. It's a blood sport in many ways, and you have the different institutes, and it's really. It is as much as like almost a religion in some cases among these people. If you get into the ultra-Orthodox Jews, you'll have these different groups, and they'll argue and fight over different stuff. And among Christian groups, they do the same thing. It's the same story with archaeologists. It's exactly the same thing. Now, I want to talk about, we're just going to go through several things here really quickly, because as I said, I know it's been a long day already, and I don't want to drag this on and on and on. And so I'm going to dip your foot in a little bit in the water so you guys can see a little bit of this. But anyways, what I want to show you here is that in the 19th century, that is the 1800s. I'm talking AD. In the 19th century AD, and because I won't refer to AD mostly. It's mostly all going to be BC. And if I say 19th century BC, that's the 1800s, before Christ was born. Okay, that's a long time ago. It's a really, it's long before I was born. I don't know, Mr. Kennedy, maybe he was back early. Yeah. But anyways, at the time, there were during the 19th century, during the time of the 1800s here, there were a lot of scholars who thought that the stories of the patriarchs, the existence of the Assyrians that you read about in Isaiah, that this was all baloney. It was exaggeration. It was all made up. It was the imagination of later writers who were coming up with fairy tales, to make a religious point, because religion was all a con. This was what in the 19th century, especially among the German rationalists, started in Germany. This particular thing, but it's far beyond that now. These were people who thought it was absolutely baloney. These days, if you went into England and you talked to some of the militant atheists, they would still buy all this stuff. They would still buy all this stuff. And I want to point out that I'm just going to cover this. We're just dipping a toe in the evidence today. Just a little bit of a toe. I want to just show you a couple highlights. And we're not really going into depth too much. I mean, it is remarkable what's out there, but people are willfully blind in this society. And among academia and the universities and everything else, they're willfully blind to the historicity of the Bible. They really are. They're doing the best they can bury their heads in the sand that they possibly can. But the evidence can be there. Now, this particular slide is of a ziggurat. And within the area we call, at this point in time, it's a rock. Okay, a ziggurat of ancient Sumer, which was one of the earliest of civilization. As it says, you can read that, a step tower that formed the platform for a temple. A ziggurat was really, this was considered the gate of the gods. If you turn, let's go to Genesis chapter 11. Genesis chapter 11. And by the way, if somebody has a question and it's on topic, I will answer it. If you want to ask me about something else that's not on topic, sometime later, or you can ask Mr. Kennedy. But anyways, this is, I will take questions if you have one, okay? We'll do that. It's just not me talking up here. I will answer questions to the best of my ability anyways. So if we go to Genesis chapter 11, it says, "Now the whole world had one language and a common speech. As men moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar and settled there. And they said to either, 'Come and let's make bricks and bake them thoroughly.' And they used brick instead of stone and tar for mortar." Well, if you know anything about Iraq, they have what in Iraq? They have oil. In antiquity, this oil would bubble up and be in big pools, and they would use this as their tar. Okay, that's if it got hot, it might get a little smelly or something, but it would dry out eventually in the sun. But they would burn the brick. Now it says, and the point was they said, "Let's build a city for ourselves and a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves and not be scattered over the face of the whole earth." But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower the men were building. And the Lord said, "If as one people speaking the same language they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Come, let's go down and confuse their language so they will not understand each other." And he did that, and they left off building that particular ziggurat. It's probably the tower they were building was quite definitely a ziggurat. This particular ziggurat was dedicated to the moon goddess, and it was built originally around 2100 BC, which is in the 2000s BC, just a shad before the time of Abraham, after, of course, at this point in time, after the flood. And the interesting point, if the count of this is in Genesis 11, 1-8. And the point that I want to make is here, because they thought, again, a lot of people thought that, well, the stories of the patriarchs was hooey. It was made up, and it was just a fantasy. But in the smallest details, the Bible preserves some very important points. The Bible was written in what we now know as the Promised Land, the land of Israel. But this, of course, is in ancient Mesopotamia, over in Iraq, as I've said. They used to burn their bricks in ovens. They'd fired them to make things out of. In ancient Israel, they rarely, if ever, did that. And yet this is a mammoth thing that was made out of fired bricks. It's just a small point, but you see something here of it's a little detail. Bible just mentions it. It's there. It was something that happened. Pillars of salt, okay? Sodom and Gomorrah. We all know the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. Of course, that's big news in our days when we have the the gays and lesbians, the transgendered, what was it called? I go you know, the ones who are all doing this thing. Anyways, you know, we talk about Sodom and Gomorrah like it was a fairy tale. Was Sodom and Gomorrah a fairy tale? Because, you know, if we go to Genesis 19, if you just turn with me here, we'll just move right over to Genesis 19. And if we look in verse 23, 19, in verse 23, it says this. By the time Lot reached Zoar, the sun had risen on the land, and the Lord rained down burning sulfur on Sodom and Gomorrah from the Lord out of the heaven. Thus he overthrew those cities and the entire plain, including all those living in the cities, and also the vegetation in the land. But Lot's wife, looking back, became a pillar of salt. There are all sorts of, you know, interesting. It was just a fanciful tale. You know, I mean, you have these pillars of salt that still, you know, exist along the Dead Sea. And of course, if you've ever been down in that area, it is desolate. It is desolate. It looks like it's been burnt out. I mean, you know, it's not a whole lot grows here. There's just such a high mineral and salt content in the soil. And it just bakes in this particular place. Now, the locations of Sodom and Gomorrah are very, very disputed. However, anciently, during the time of the patriarchs and even somewhat before them, there were cities here. There was an occupation. People lived there. And some of those cities, they can see, have different ash layers that they were, you know, the invaders came in, conquered the city, burnt it, which was typical. Remember the story of Abraham and Lot. Lot was taken captive by this army that came in off of Mesopotamia. They took everybody captive. They burnt the city. Well, there are, you know, in this one particular mound or tell, which is in antiquity, if you had a good water source or something, people would continue to settle there all the time because water is so precious. We take it for granted in Canada. We can find water any place you want. That's not true in the Middle East. People settled where there was a reliable, drinkable, potable water. And they would settle there generation after generation after generation. And, you know, the way they did it in those days, they didn't have the garbage trucks come and haul everything away. They would just knock down the walls of Grandpa's place and just build on top of it. And they kept doing this generation. You know, I mean, they didn't really clean out very much. You get all the bones and stuff, knock it down, put something new, too many rats and other stuff. And they kept going up. They get higher and higher and higher generation. You're living on your trash from your ancestors. That's what they did. They lived all, you know, and it got better because you got a view. You know, I have a better view than great-grandfather because I'm about 10 feet up from him, you know. You know, all this junk's down there, and I'm living up here. I just keep building up the walls, you know. But they did that. They did that. And in Sodom and Gomorrah, they did that too. And you have evidence of early Bronze Age occupations. Now, what's interesting, this one particular place, Bab ed Dirah, which is over there in the Jordan River Valley, about where we would expect, you know, these cities of the plain to be, they have found, in doing the excavations, they found that there's one place where they built their people, they buried them, where they buried their dead was in mausoleums, or what they sometimes call charnel houses, charnel being bones or fleshly, you know. They would put them in these mausoleums where, of course, the dead people, where their, you know, flesh would rot off their bones, and then they'd stack the bones up, and they did this lovely things like that. You know, old bones smell really interesting. If you've never been in caves full of old bones, I have. They have a peculiar old odor. You know, 1,000, 2,000-year-old bones. You know, it's a unique smell. It really is. But that's what they used to do in this time too. And these mausoleums, it turns out, when the archaeologists excavated it, they discovered. Now, a mausoleum is just where you have old bones and people who are rotting and dying, okay? And these were like community type of things. They discovered that these places, they had these 5 mausoleums, had been burnt, and they were burnt from their rooftops down. The Lord rained down fire and brimstone. It didn't come from the side as a sweeping, you know, from a wind, from something. These were immediately outside of the city, and why would somebody bother wasting their time on a mausoleum if you were conquering? Why would you take 10 seconds of your time to worry about that? So they found this, and this makes it very, very interesting for them to look at that. Here is a place about that time, and they can find, yeah, there was evidence of a big fire, and it burnt the buildings, these mausoleums, from the roof down. That's an interesting point. Now, making bricks. All right. We know that very clearly. Let's go to Exodus. Exodus chapter 1. Get all the way through Genesis. Exodus 1. You remember the story. Exodus 1 and verse 6. Now Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation died, but the Israelites were fruitful and multiplied greatly and became exceedingly numerous, so that the land was filled with them. Then a new king who did not know Joseph came to power in Egypt. Look, he said to his people, the Israelites have become too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous, and if war breaks out, we'll join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country. So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor. And they built Pithom and Ramses as store cities for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. So the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and worked them ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter with hard labor in brick and mortar and all kinds of work in the fields. And in all the hard labor, the Egyptians used them ruthlessly. This particular Egyptian tomb painting is showing you it's a scene of how these Asiatic Semitic slaves made mud bricks. This was from a tomb of an official who lived, a high official who lived during the 18th Egyptian dynasty during the time of Thutmose III. Now, Thutmose III is a very interesting character. His mother was Hatshepsut, who National Geographic had a big article on her. She was famous. It's called the daughter of Pharaoh. And that wasn't just the fact that she was a Pharaoh's daughter. She was the daughter of Pharaoh. She was the daughter, direct descendant of the founder of the 18th dynasty, which is about the time of 1535. 1535, which is 10 or 15 years perhaps before Moses was born. Hatshepsut, daughter of Pharaoh, you know the story. Who rescued Moses? It was a daughter. It makes the point. It says just the daughter of Pharaoh. Just is it a coincidence? Well, Thutmose III was really during the time when he was growing up. His mother ran him. She was boss until he got to his full mature age, and then he put mom in her place, and he knocked off her face off of the statues and stuff like this, and he became a tough guy, but anybody who was connected with her became ousted from office. They became very persona non grata. Was he the Pharaoh of the oppression? Or I should say, was his father, the time of Hatshepsut, was that the Pharaoh of the oppression? Well, it's a very interesting thing. We read here that the Egyptians were concerned about the Israelites because they thought that if they got too numerous, they might join their enemies, because the dynasty before the 18th dynasty was not Egyptian. It was Hyksos. The Hyksos were a Semitic people. The Israelites, the Hebrews, were a Semitic people. Okay? I have Semitic features. Most of us sitting in this room have Semitic features. Okay, this is what Semitic features look like. Okay, from this standpoint, that's the way the Egyptians. If you know what Egyptian looks like, Egyptians are children of Ham. They look different. Okay, it's a bit different. And these are the people they were making do this. You have this whole process of digging out
digging out the clay and putting the water and making the bricks and forming them, and then mixing it with straw and then setting it in the sun and then building a wall with it. This was done during the time of Thutmose III, that this was a big deal that they were doing this. Now, Thutmose III's son was a man who took the name of Amenhotep II. And there are a lot of people who think and have thought in the church, I'm not the first one by any means, that he was a pharaoh of the oppression. Okay? He was the pharaoh of the oppression. The interesting thing about Amenhotep II, he was about as proud as you get. He said he was better than all the pharaohs that went before him. He could run faster, and he could shoot better with the bow and arrow and throw that javelin harder, and he could beat his enemies into the ground. And nobody was like him, and he was a great military guy, and he was full of himself like nobody else. This guy was really full of himself in a remarkable way, even for the Egyptians, pharaohs. He had a big head. But it turns out, towards the end of his reign, all of a sudden he seems very quiet. He's no longer running around conquering, his enemies. His military action just completely stops. In fact, after he dies, the person who takes over from him is not his firstborn son. He's nowhere to be seen. It's this other guy who comes in and takes the name of Thutmose of the Fourth, his father's, previous, but he wasn't figured to be in part of the succession order. He wasn't even there originally. They have to dig this guy. They have to come up with this guy. What happened to Amenhotep's firstborn son? Well, that's a good question. It's a question that there's not a really good answer. Following him, after Thutmose IV, you have the fellow who succeeded him took the name of Amenhotep III, who was about 1390 to 1352 BC. Okay, the Exodus was about 1445 traditionally. The entry into the land, the promised land, was about 1405 BC. This is using your traditional chronology, okay? This is how you look at it. This fellow here, Amenhotep III, reigned 1390 to 1352. So he's something in the neighborhood of 15 years after the Israelites traditionally entered into the land, and about 55 years after the Exodus. Now, what do we have something from this fellow. It's called the Soleb hieroglyphic, which was discovered within this last century, and it has the first mention, and almost all of the scholars would agree. It says it's to Yahweh. It actually, in his funerary temple along the Nile River, and I think it was in Upper Egypt, they have a picture, and that shows all of his captives. Okay, he's got their arms bound behind him in the different ones, and I took so-and-so captive, so-and-so captive. And he mentions that he took the Shasu, some captive, those of Yahweh, YHW, which in Egyptian translates almost universally, most academics would say. They don't argue, it means Yahweh. This is the first mention of Yahweh, and not in the Bible, and it's only 55 years. And what they called the people there, the Shasu, that was this was talking about Bedouin people who wandered around, who were living in the area of what we know as the Promised Land. Very interesting. It is coincidence, just a coincidence. Well, it could be. We have Nile. The Nile River is one of those things. The story of the Nile in the Exodus stories, like Moses, they threw the babies into the Nile. The Pharaoh of the oppression said, to try to control the Israelites, they were going to have their own version of abortion. Okay, we just want to get rid of the male babies, though, because the females make, good fun objects, and besides maids, so they keep the girls and kill the boys. That'll keep them under control, and we'll absorb them that way. But of course, what the story was, it didn't work. But they did kill, who knows how many Hebrew baby boys. We have no idea. You know, in the United States over the last number of years, since the early 70s, they've killed about 48 million by abortion. Here in Canada, it's about 3 million something. Okay, from that. So it does, you know, the figures, who knows how many it was. But the ancient ancient Egypt, the Nile was a symbol of order and life. In fact, it was symbolized by a god, you know, that they would have these gods wrapped around the symbols of Upper and Lower Egypt. So the Nile was a very big thing. And it's one of the fascinating things is that you see, of course, so what was the first of the 10 plagues that God hit these people with? He turned their river that they saw as a source of life and the source of order and a great pride to them, he turned it into blood. How many baby boys had they thrown that? He turned it into blood. He turned it into a symbol of death. And of course, it was disorder, if you read, because they were having to dig about it to try to find some sort of fresh water. It's an interesting thing, you know, like when you look back at it, the point is that was the whole perspective of the time. If it was, you know, 1,000 years later, if the Bible was written, how would they know that, you know, how the ancient Egyptians felt like that? But we know from all of, you know, their carvings and whatever, that's exactly how they felt. It was a true reference to how they felt. Now, another point that is interesting, in this particular slide, you see the Egyptian texts and the Bible agree on 6 key chronological steps of the Israelite trek. Even though scholars do not agree where these places are located, what they've discovered is that the route to the promised land that is mentioned in Numbers 33, verses 45 to 49, that's Numbers, we'll go there. Let's go to Numbers 33. Numbers 33, 45 to 49. One of the things you find out about the Bible, and archaeologists study, because if you talk to archaeologists, they know their Bible, the Israeli ones. They will read it meticulously. They have been reading it all their lives because they are looking at even the smallest details. They're considering even the smallest details. And they're useful because here in Numbers 33, and we're 45 to 49, I'll read it. And most of us would just go, you know, eyes glaze over it, we'd read right over it. Like, so what? Why is this in the story? 45, they left Iyim and camped at Dibon Gad. They left Dibon Gad and camped at Alom Diblathaim. They left Almon Diblathaim and camped in the mountains of Abarim near Nebo. They left the mountains of Abarim and camped in the plains of Moab across by the Jordan across from Jericho. There on the plains of Jericho, they camped along the Jordan from Beth Jeshmoth to Abel Shittim. Anyways, the point is this. This little detail they have found on Egyptian monuments, on 3 different Egyptian monuments, a match for this itinerary that follows it in the sequence that the Bible mentions right here, because it was an Egyptian military road. See, the Egyptians were used to conquering, going up to, you know, okay, let's go up and get a bunch of slaves and see what kind of gold we can shake down from the people and grab some women and stuff like that. They used to do that all the time. Societies ran on slaves and stuff you could loot off of other people. That's how ancient, that's what they did it for. And they knew where all the water sources, because each one of these places would have been where there was water. And they knew, they had the list of where to go from one place to another. And in 3 Egyptian monuments, okay, of this time, of Thutmose III, okay, who was perhaps, you know, the father of the Pharaoh of the Exodus, and 2 from Amenhotep III, the Soleb, whatever, who was just 50 years afterwards. They have seen, they have on the walls printed the exact same order of these places. Is it a coincidence? A little detail in the Bible of a list of places, exactly same order, same names. We don't even know where these places are because they were probably just camping spots that had a spring. It's fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. Calf worship. Okay, we know something about the golden calf. Okay, who hasn't heard about the golden calf? It was a problem. Okay,
we've been into worshiping our cattle and our beef for a long time. Alberta beef, okay, it comes from the good, there's a good background to this. Now, this little idol, this particular little idol was found at Ashkelon just in 1990. Okay, this isn't was a fairly recent find at this point in time, just 20 years old, but it was startling for what they found it at Ashkelon. It's only about 4 inches. Most people have this idea that, I suppose, from Basil Wolverton in the old days in the Church of God, movement, they thought these great big idols. So no, idols were actually pretty small. This was only like 4 inches high by 4.5 inches long. Okay, so it's fairly small. Metal was expensive. Okay, remember, metal was very expensive. And they had this little shrine, and it was outside the city, and they'd haul it out during the day, and the god would be there, and they'd haul it in. Well, you see that bulls and calves symbolized strength, virility, and kingship for the ancient, pagan religions, right? I mean, fertility was a big deal. They, sex was a big deal for them, and they did all sorts of stuff about it. And the Israelites, of course, where they were in ancient Egypt, the worship of the calf and the bull. We heard a little bit about the Apis bulls earlier today. But they had, a variety of these. The calf, which was smaller, and then the foal. They did this, and we know very clearly from that the golden calf was a major problem. That this was something that was a stumbling block to the Israelites. We know also, if we go to 1 Kings, let's go to 1 Kings, and we'll do chapter 12, 1 Kings 12. 1 Kings 12 and verse 28. 1 Kings 12 and verse 28. Well, I'll start at verse 25. Now Jeroboam fortified Shechem in the hill country of Ephraim and lived there. And from there he went out and built up Peniel. And Jeroboam thought to himself, Jeroboam, of course, is the one who broke the northern 10 tribes away from the house of David and the southern 3 tribes, which were to then be composed of Judah, Benjamin, and Levite, because all the Levites were kicked out from the northern 10 tribes, okay? So Jeroboam thought to himself, the kingdom will likely revert to the house of David. If these people go up to offer sacrifices at the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem, they will again give their allegiance to their lord Rehoboam, king of Judah. They will kill me and return to King Rehoboam. After seeking advice, the king made 2 golden calves. Oh, yes, I can just see these advisors coming up. Oh, let's go to idolatry. We have a precedent for this. I mean, we've always liked this anyways, calves and bulls, He said to the people, it is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Here are your gods, O Israel, who brought you out of Egypt. And he set one up in Bethel and the other in Dan. The thing became a sin, and the people went even as far as Dan to worship the one there. Well, it's very clear that this sort of thing was common. They went down to Egypt. This sort of thing was going down there. They came up. They didn't get rid of all the Canaanites. It was common there. They were syncretistic. And if you think they're stupid doing this, why do we do the Christmas tree? Where in the Bible do we have where's the Christmas tree? I mean, our society right now, we are very syncretistic ourselves. Especially now that we have multiculturalism, we like to bring in something from all the gods and whatever we can make up besides. We're just like our ancestors from this aspect. They were really not a whole lot different than we are. Merneptah Stela. Merneptah was one of the Egyptian pharaohs of the 1200s, BC. And the fascinating thing about the Merneptah Stela, it was discovered in 1896. So, a little over, at this point in time, 15, 16 years ago, something like this. Anyways, what was remarkable and astounding about this is that on line 27 of the stele, because what you don't see there is that's all hieroglyphics going down the face. Okay, very small, but this is about 7 feet high. Okay, the stele is about 7 feet high, big piece of granite, okay, carved in there. I mean, somebody did some pretty fine work. They spent a lot of money. The Egyptians were always eager. I mean, it's a test. How great I am! That's what it is. It's old propaganda.
Okay, all the pharaohs liked to tout themselves. By the way, that's, in most of ancient literature, when you find them and you go back to 1200 BC or something like this, they're all touting how great I am. My God's bigger than your God, and my whatever is bigger than your wig or whatever. And, they do that. The Bible, does the Bible whitewash? Does the Bible whitewash the leaders of ancient or the people of Israel? It doesn't. The Bible is unique in ancient history because it tells the good, the bad, and the ugly stories. It tells them all. The good, the bad, and the ugly stories. It is unique. Not many people will tell of all their stupid mistakes. That's because it wasn't of human inspiration. I would posit that. I would make that argument. But the Merneptah Stela in this case, discovered in 1896, was carved about originally somewhere around 2009, 2010 BC, during the reign of the pharaoh Merneptah. What's fascinating about this, on line 27, you have the only mention, direct, full mention of Israel in ancient Egyptian records. Ancient Egyptian records. And he is saying in this thing that was carved in 1209 BC, he said this: Israel is laid waste, his seed is not. And the way ancient Egyptian worked is after, like most Semitic languages, you have a noun if you have something, and then you can have a suffix that's appended to that, and it tells you if it's my people, his people, or it'll give some further description to that noun. And at the end of Israel, they had what they call a determinative that described in ancient Egyptian that it was a nomadic people. See, if they came in the land 1205 BC, the Egyptians were still thinking of them as nomads. Remember that earlier one that I talked about in the Soleb hieroglyphic? They were called, they were thinking of them as Bedouin, which, that was fair enough at the time, really it was. And, that they were considering it. But the amazing thing is this: it's saying that they're already there 1200 BC. There still are lots of people. And you open your Bibles, they'll say, the children of Israel did the Exodus during the times of Ramses II. Well, that's 200 years late. 200 years late. And they say, no, we can't find any evidence for Israel being there. No, they're looking 200 years too late. Of course. Look, in Canada, if we went back 200 years to look for the, Great Canadian, whatever, what would we find? We would find nothing here. Maybe a shell midden here or there. You'd find nothing to determine the Israelites were there. No, you got some shell middens. You had some, people who threw sticks and, and made stone knives and stuff or whatever. Ran around, hunter-gatherers, a little. See, it makes that difference. If you put it in modern whatever, 200 years coming to here, what would you have in Penticton? Go outside and dig. Not a whole lot. Makes a difference of when you're looking for it. So you cannot sometimes understand what you find, but the Merneptah Stela limits it. It says very clearly that Israel was mentioned 1200 BC. You can't just say they weren't there. By that time they were already there. Okay, go next. Altar. This is at Arad in the Negev. Oh, it's about 10, 15 miles from Beersheba. It's an altar of unhewn stone. What's interesting of this, of course, is what? Let's go to Exodus 20. Exodus 20. And how am I doing for time? Exodus 20. Boy, time goes by fast while you're having fun. Okay. Exodus 20 and verse 20, I believe it is 2. The Lord said to Moses, tell the Israelites this: you have seen for yourself what I have spoken to you from heaven. Do not make any gods to be alongside of me. Do not make for yourself any gods of silver or gods of gold. No little calves either, by the way. Make an altar of earth for me and sacrifice on it your burnt offerings and fellowship offerings, your sheep and your goats and your cattle. Wherever I cause my name to be honored, I will come to you and bless you. I will make an altar of stones for me. Do not build it with dressed stones. Okay, you weren't supposed to get your chisel out and make it square or rectangular. undressed stones. Okay, and for if you make it with dressed stones, you will defile it if you use a tool on it. And do not go up to my altar on steps, lest your nakedness be exposed on it. Because as you know, in the old days, guys, we didn't wear pants, did we? We weren't wearing the pants in the family. We were wearing the skirt of the family. That's the way it was, guys. We were wearing skirts in the old days. Because, it's hot over there, and you need the air circulation. Be perfectly frank, that's the way it worked. And so obviously, if you have the priest going up and everybody's down there, yeah. God didn't want any of that. Okay, so it was you had a ramp to go up there. Later on in this temple, you might have had steps, but God made these things that the Aaronic priesthood, they had to wear underwear made out of linen, okay? So they had to wear underwear. So, it's a little point. But the interesting thing about this is that they've discovered this altar in a rod. Oh, you say, why were they building an altar if it was not at Jerusalem? Well, what do you know about the Bible? What do you know about what it says here? Let's go to 1 Kings 18. 1 Kings 18. First Kings 18:4. Oh, wait, is it 1 Kings 18:4? Do I get the right one? Maybe it's 2 Kings 18:4. I think it's 2 Kings 18:4. Because I've got the wrong... Okay, 18:4. All right, yeah, this is it. Okay, it's talking about Hezekiah, okay, who became king of Israel. And verse 3, he did what was right in the sight of the eyes of the Lord, just as his father David had done. He removed the high places, smashed the sacred stones, and cut down the Asherah poles. Okay, these were all removed the high places. A high place is where you worshiped. It's where you had an altar. See, they didn't necessarily think at that time that there's only one place you could have an altar. Obviously. And he removed this stuff. You see, the problem is that you get some of these things, and then besides you having your altar to Yahweh, you'd have an Asherah pole to Asherah, the fertility goddess, woohoo, where they would do their thing, party hardy. That's what that was all about. It was a good party thing, and it was a symbol. It was a symbol of sex worship, which was a big thing of the Canaanites that the Israelites took from them, because our ancestors happened to like that. They thought it was cool. And he also talks about he broke in pieces the bronze snake Moses had made, for up to that time the Israelites had been burning incense to it. It was called the Hush time. But Hezekiah realizes this was idolatry, and he was having, and he did his best to eradicate it. And what you discover with this, that this altar went out of use at the time of Hezekiah in the 8th century BC. So it stopped. So this is one of the places that Hezekiah put out of use. How did he, they had their ways of defiling an altar ceremonially that nobody would use it again. Probably not too pleasant to think about. But he did that. And you find that listed in 2 Chronicles 31:1. It's something that they made. It's just a little note, but here's the evidence. It was an altar made according to the strict letter of the law. Oh, yes, it was syncretistic. You had the other stuff around it. But, we kind of ignore that. We're inclusive. We're a little multicultural. Everybody can, all come together. All worship together. Gods of your choice, whichever one, But fascinating. Balaam in history. Yeah. In one of the Israelite cities, they think it's maybe Peniel. Perhaps it is Sukkot, the biblical Sukkot. You find here a reference to this character of Numbers 22 and 24. You've heard of Balaam before, haven't you? Anybody here not heard of Balaam? Well, it turns out that Balaam, they thought he was a historical character, because at that time, when they did an excavation, now this would have been this was in the Jordan, Jordan River Valley, about midway. It's now in what we'd call the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan. Okay, they did an excavation, and they found in this place, which was an Israelite city, an inscription on the wall of Tel Dir Allah. They found a recounting of part of the prophecies of Balaam. And they had his name repeated several times. They wrote most of the prophecies in black, but whenever you came to Balaam's name, they put it in red. Just like we have in our Bible, we put Jesus' name in red or something like this, and Jesus said, they did that. That was interesting. That the ancient Egyptians used to do that. This is an old kind of practice, put the letters in red, and some of them special ones, and the others in black. They did it back then, too. And here on this wall was written these fragments mentioning Balaam's name. Nobody doubts that this is referring to the same guy, because there's too many similarities of the prophet and how he had his visions and what he did and what he said. And why would they have this on an Israelite household wall? Well, because it was like Balaam was giving them legitimacy to the land. Even back then, I guess they were having to argue with people that they were legitimately in the land, and this was theirs. This was their land, okay? It wasn't the Moabites or whoever else, just like the Israelis today argue with the Palestinians over whose land it is. It was the same thing back then. Weights and measures, yeah, they had them, and they had problems with people corrupting them. They had liars and frauds. Now, Gezer. You had, here in Gezer was one of those cities that, very fascinating, because they found all these standing stones, 10 of them, Mesopot standing stones. From this standpoint of the standing stones, that this is the type of thing that the ancient Israelites like to do. In fact, you'll find this whole idea of standing stones repeated. The Celts like to do that, by the way, just out of curiosity. That's just a free giveaway. But you had here in Joshua 24, Joshua did what? He erected a large stone in the town of Shechem as a witness to the oaths. And when they crossed the river, the Jordan River, remember, they took the stones out and then they plastered it and wrote on it the law. Well, that was a custom that they used to do back then. And they're there. Okay, this is a different place. 10 stones. We don't know all the stories. Obviously, there was a covenant-making ceremony in this place. Something that we find, in history, and as you find that people, they continue to do it across in the Celtic areas. Some of these things continue a long time. Shofar, yes, it's very evident when you talk about Joshua and the city of Jericho going on all the shofars and stuff like this. Yeah, in antiquity, they used them very clearly. The type, the ram's horn, was used in all types of instruments. Now, I want to talk about Jericho real quickly. I have visited Jericho, and I have seen the walls of Jericho. And what's interesting is you see, this is restoration. You see how the walls of Jericho, there were two walls. As the tell went up, as you remember, I was telling you the story about how you have these succession layers of different, you're standing on, 10 feet above Grandpa's dump, and, you kept, because they'd bring in new dirt and throw it on the ground and build up, that's how they did it. They'd knock down maybe walls, or they got invaded, and then they'd just knock it down, level it out, and build again, up. That's how they did it. In Jericho, it was the same thing. You had all these successive layers. At the time when Joshua, at this time, they had a retaining wall at the bottom of the tell, and then a large mud brick wall coming up, and then you had the upper city protected by another mud brick wall. Well, what they have found when they excavated this, they discovered that the walls for most of the city the lower walls had collapsed down. You're looking at something here that the walls at the bottom retaining wall was about 4 to 5 meters, that's 12 to 15 feet high. On top of that, there was a mud brick wall, 2 meters, about 6 feet thick, 2 meters thick, and about 6 to 8 meters, 20 to 26 feet high. That's a good size wall. And if you're running around it on the outside, you're looking up like this. And you just think about the difficulty of trying to invade a place like that, because it's being defended by archers and whatever else, and they can just pick you off. It's turkey shoot, to try to get up there. But what you find when you excavate it is that you discover that the bottom walls had what you find is had collapsed down. And it just formed a nice ramp to go straight up the city. When you read the account, you say, they all shouted the walls collapsed, and they went up into the city. I've seen the collapsed walls myself. It's actually what happened. And the evidence is still there. Now, one of the things that they discovered, there was one section of the wall that the Germans excavated in 1907, 1909. I think it was on the northern part of the wall. They discovered it wasn't collapsed. There was one part of the wall that wasn't collapsed. Does anybody know why part of the wall of Jericho? It says the wall collapsed, but one part of it didn't collapse. Why? Yes, you had Rahab the harlot. Her wall, her house was built on that lower, right into the wall. That's how they built it, and that's how they found it. That these houses, the back wall was the city wall. And she was living literally right on the wall, or in the wall. And there's one place that they discovered that hadn't collapsed. And it happened to be the side towards the mountains. Fascinating. Just coincidence, of course. Now, there was another unusual thing that was found in ancient Jericho, this particular same city. They found a big ash layer, by the way. The place was burnt. And they didn't find a whole lot of different things, but you know what they found in abundance in Jericho? This particular destruction layer with the walls collapsed down and with the one section of the wall that was still there. They found this. They found jars full of grain were found in the rubble. It obviously, because the jars were all full, it was springtime, shortly after harvest. Otherwise, people eat this food. If it was a different time, they would have been, you wouldn't have found so much. But what was particularly unusual is the grain was left. Grain in the ancient world was worth real hard money. It was worth its weight, a certain weight of silver or gold. It would have been one thing if your average conqueror coming through to take a city, what would they would not have left the foodstuffs. They wouldn't have burnt the place before they got all the grain out. I mean, it's stupid. Why would you do it? Why is it here? What is the commandment? Were the Israelites allowed to take anything they wanted? The scriptures say, everything was devoted except for certain metal things which could be melted down. Everything else was to be burnt. And they left the grain. They left it. And the grain is still there. And it was burnt. Big ash layer that covered the whole thing. Collapsed walls, collapsed, just like that, the mud brick. Part of the wall that wasn't collapsed, we had a house built right in on the north side, the grain. Amazing. All very amazing. And of course, you have the pottery. And they both showed, the pottery, both a couple of the archaeologists, because it's been repeatedly dug. Garston and Kenyon wrote, of the burn layers. The burn layer is very evident. When you go into archaeology and you look at these things, you can see burn layers are very evident in these things. Because you remember, they had to use wood, for the beams of the houses and stuff. Even if they built with mud brick, you had to have a certain amount of this. And when they burn these things, it burnt everything, any sort of, the furniture and all the rest. Mount Ebal and Gerizim, this is one of those places where they actually, remember we were talking about the altars? This is another place they found an altar made of unhewn stones. And they found all these sacrificial animal bones. And you know what? There were no pig bones. There were only goats and sheep. This is Mount Ebal. And it was obviously a cultic. I mean, it was used for a religious purpose. They had a little wall around it to show what area was holy that nobody could go through. For the priesthood, this is the presence. They had they have the animal bones. They have the altar made of unhewn stone and dirt. And, again, that's a little bit of a reconstruction. Oh, they had the ramp too. So there's nobody going to get their jollies, from the priesthood going up to the altar on the, to do the offering. David's sling, yes, of course. The slingers were used. The Pool of Gibeon, I actually have been to this too. This is actually there where you have the account of that, Abner and David, the soldiers of David and Abner met to have this contest at the Pool of Gibeon, and it's there, just like it's written up. And now the final thing I want to go through just a little bit to mention is that, for a long time people thought that the house of David was just a myth. They thought, well, is it really, that it was Arthurian, it's like King Arthur and Camelot, type of thing. And they, the people who wanted to track the Bible said, they've tried one thing, if that doesn't work, we'll try something else. And they've tried to say that David isn't really there. But they've discovered that in this one particular, this was up in Tel Dan, that they, actually it's the nephew of the fellow I worked for, Benjamin Mazar, who was doing the dig. And he discovered that the Hazazel of Damascus, remember that they were some of the big enemies of Israel. They conquered the city at one point in time, and he put up his victory stele to boast, because that's what kings did. You boast on your conquest. And he mentions his victory over the house of David. Even though it was the northern Israelite tribes that they rebelled, the house of David still had all the cachet. They were they had the reputation, right, of being, David was a tough guy. So I think, and it's also mentioned, you have the house of David. They mention Omri and the house of David later on, and the Meshi stele, which was a Moabite stone discovered in 1868. This is actually in the British Museum, and I had the honor of feeling it, and actually, when the guards weren't looking. I touched it, from that standpoint. I think we'll stop there, because you have more and more and more and more, and it can go on and 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 on. Okay. So some of the things, I'm constantly trying to keep track of, where's my thing here? Maybe I put it back in here. I'm trying to keep, I follow the news from time to time and just make note of when things happen. And you will find that they come up with different things. If you watch the news, one more piece of information, you'll come up with something, for instance, like, I won't use that one. This one. And this was a couple years ago. This was now, in 2005, November 14th. Archaeological dig there in Gath. Whose name did they come up with in digging up? Who is very famous coming out of a Philistine city in Gath, called Gath? Goliath. Well, lo and behold, they came up with a potsherd that had Goliath's name on it.
And his brother's name.
Oh, he did. It was a family name, obviously. Goliath. They've come up with ancient Hebrew now that they can track all the way back. Yeah, they recently discovered writing in Hebrew all the way back to the time of David. So they used to say, well, they couldn't really write and all this. But it was baloney. Bottom line is that there are literally hundreds and hundreds, actually thousands of different points which confirm very even minute aspects of the Bible. God did not put this book together haphazardly. What he had written down here sometimes seems like just, it's just detail. Why is he saying that? Whatever. There's a meaning to it, whether it's historical. God, I think he saw some of these things. Why did they preserve their camping spots on the way out of Egypt? Well, because later on, for the skeptics now, we can say, hey, it matches the actual historical record. Or some of these other things we find. It's there. So basically the point is that we're not believing fables. Okay, this isn't just a legend. It's just not something that somebody made up because they wanted to exert their control over the people and rip them off of their tithes and offerings or whatever it might have been. God wrote this, and the information, what we have here, is you can bet your life on it. And many people have.
And more